It didn't collapse in a single night. It eroded, ledger by ledger, loan by loan, barrel by barrel. The Soviet Union, the greatest industrial experiment in human history, did not die from ideology or invasion. It died from insolvency. In the 1970s, the USSR seemed unshakable. It had rebuilt after a world war, conquered space, and controlled 1/6 of the planet's surface. Its military budget rivaled that of the United States. Its citizens were told they lived in the world's second superpower, an empire of factories, steel, and discipline. But beneath that image, something fragile was growing. The Soviet economy was not an engine. It was a machine powered by borrowed fuel. The roots of this dependence stretched back decades. The command economy that had built tanks and satellites could not build efficiency. The Soviet Union could produce everything, but produce it badly. Steel plants consumed too much coal. Tractors broke faster than they could be repaired. Entire factories operated to meet quotas, not demand. Success was measured in tons, not value. To keep this immense machine running, the USSR needed one thing above all: hard currency. Rubles were worthless abroad, so the empire needed dollars, marks, and francs, real money, to buy food, machinery, and technology from the West. And the only reliable way to earn those dollars was through oil. When oil prices soared after the 1973 Arab embargo, the Soviet Union was suddenly rich. The global energy crisis that crippled the West became the lifeline of the East. For the first time, the USSR had more dollars than it knew what to do with. Its leaders used a windfall to fund everything: military expansion, social programs, subsidies to client states across Eastern Europe and Africa. It looked like victory, but it wasn't income. It was illusion. Oil became the empire's drug, and the world's addiction paid the bills. Every barrel exported masked the inefficiencies inside. Each year, the Soviet budget relied more heavily on petrodollars. By the late 1970s, nearly 70% of its foreign earnings came from energy. That dependence was invisible to the public, but absolute. The Soviet Union was no longer an ideological fortress. It was an oil company with an army. Meanwhile, the Cold War intensified. The arms race accelerated. Space exploration expanded, and the costs grew unbearable. The Politburo's answer was the same as every desperate government in history: borrow. In secret meetings with Western bankers, Soviet officials negotiated massive credit lines. The USSR, publicly condemning capitalism, quietly used its money. French and German banks extended billions in loans, confident that a superpower could never default. But every loan came with a leash. The more the Soviets borrowed, the more they needed to keep exporting oil to repay. It was a trap disguised as prosperity. By 1980, the Soviet foreign debt exceeded $30 billion, enormous for a state that officially had no private sector. Still, the oil kept flowing, and as long as prices stayed high, the machine held together. Then, in 1981, the trap snapped shut. Oil prices crashed. The market that had once filled Moscow's coffers suddenly turned hostile. Revenue fell by half in a single year. What had been manageable debt became suffocating. The USSR could no longer pay for both guns and grain. It had to choose, and it tried to do both. Inside the Kremlin, economists warned a disaster. Without Western imports, factories would stall. Without foreign credit, trade would freeze. But no one wanted to be the first to tell the General Secretary that socialism was living on capitalist loans. The system was built on obedience, not honesty. So they lied through reports, statistics, and production targets, until reality became undeniable. By the mid-1980s, the numbers were catastrophic. The ruble was effectively unconvertible. Foreign reserves were nearly gone. Debt repayments consumed most of the export income. Even the satellite states, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, were drowning in their own Western loans, all guaranteed by Moscow. The empire's financial burden had turned inward. And then came Mikhail Gorbachev. When he took power in 1985, he inherited not a superpower, but a balance sheet in crisis. His slogans, perestroika and glasnost, were meant to reform and open the system, but they were also desperate responses to bankruptcy. Gorbachev understood that without Western cooperation, the Soviet Union couldn't survive another decade. He needed credit, technology, and time. To get them, he had to convince the West that the USSR could change. So he liberalized trade. He reduced military spending. He even began talks to end the Cold War. For a brief moment, it worked. Western leaders celebrated him as a reformer. Banks extended new credit lines. The IMF quietly opened doors that had once been sealed. The Soviet Union appeared to be recovering, but behind the optimism, its foundation continued to crumble. Because reform doesn't fix insolvency, it only delays collapse. Gorbachev's partial opening unleashed forces he couldn't control. As censorship faded, citizens began to see what the rest of the world looked like, and what their own system had hidden. Shortages, inefficiency, and corruption became impossible to ignore. Public trust, already thin, evaporated. Meanwhile, national republics like Ukraine and the Baltics realized that their resources, their oil, their coal, their labor, were paying for Moscow's debts. They wanted out. The empire's unity depended on its ability to pay. Once the money stopped, loyalty vanished. By 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. By 1990, the USSR's foreign debt reached nearly $60 billion. For the first time in history, a nuclear superpower was technically bankrupt. That was when the facade cracked completely. Factories stopped paying workers. Supermarkets emptied. The ruble's value collapsed. In one surreal episode, Soviet officials had to ask for emergency grain shipments from the United States, the same nation they had spent decades calling their mortal enemy. The Cold War didn't end in victory. It ended in foreclosure. The Soviet Union was not defeated by ideology, but by arithmetic. By 1990, the illusion of control was gone. The Soviet Union was drowning in promises it could no longer afford to keep. The state that once prided itself on never bowing to Western bankers now depended on them for survival. Credit lines from Paris and Tokyo became lifelines. Every barrel of oil, every ton of gas, every grain of wheat was pledged to pay off debts. The empire that had financed revolutions now mortgaged its own future. The balance sheets told a story the ideology couldn't hide. Soviet gold reserves were shrinking fast, sold quietly to meet interest payments. The ruble, worthless abroad, floated inside a collapsing system where prices no longer meant anything. Inflation began to seep through the cracks of a supposedly planned economy. For decades, the state had controlled every price, every wage, every resource. Now, the market began to fight back. Factories that once operated under the illusion of infinite stability suddenly had to face reality. Their Western suppliers demanded payment in hard currency, not promises. Ministries that had controlled production for generations found themselves unable to even buy spare parts. By the summer of 1990, industrial output had fallen by 12%. The empire of production was now producing nothing of value. The crisis deepened as the Soviet Union lost its clients. Eastern Europe, once bound by debt and ideology, began to break free. Poland defaulted on its loans. Hungary turned westward. East Germany vanished into a united Germany, taking with it one of Moscow's largest financial dependents. Each defection stripped away another layer of Soviet creditworthiness. The bankers in London and Paris no longer saw a superpower. They saw a bad investment. When the Gulf War broke out in 1990, oil prices briefly surged, offering a glimmer of relief. But it wasn't enough. Years of inefficiency had left the Soviet oil industry decaying. Production was falling just when prices mattered most. For the first time in decades, the USSR imported more energy than it exported to some regions of its own empire. The machine was feeding on itself. Inside the Kremlin, desperation turned to improvisation. Officials sold gold reserves on the London market in secret auctions. They negotiated food loans from the United States and Germany, loans secured by promises of future reforms. At home, Gorbachev announced a radical restructuring of the financial system. Decentralization, partial privatization, limited market freedom. But it was too little, too late. The reforms shattered the last illusion holding the country together. The belief that the state could always provide. Prices began to spiral as supply chains collapsed. Regional governments hoarded food and fuel. The central budget lost control over spending. In Moscow, bureaucrats watched the monetary base triple in just 2 years. Hyperinflation was no longer a Western problem. It was Soviet reality. And yet, even as the economy collapsed, the debt grew. By 1991, the USSR owed nearly $70 billion to foreign creditors. Interest payments alone consumed most of its export income. Western governments debated whether to bail it out or let it fall. The United States hesitated. Germany, now reunited, offered conditional aid, but none of it mattered. The system was beyond saving. In the summer of 1991, the empire cracked from within. A failed coup by hardliners shattered what little confidence remained. For a few tense days, the world watched tanks roll through Moscow, a desperate attempt to preserve power as the economy bled out beneath them. When the coup failed, the Soviet flag itself began to lose meaning. One by one, the republics declared independence. Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, each carried away a piece of the empire and part of its debt. When the Soviet Union officially dissolved on December 26, 1991, it left behind the wreckage of an idea and a balance sheet that no one wanted to own. The new Russian Federation inherited most of the debt and none of the stability. Overnight, the ruble became just another collapsing currency. Prices multiplied 100-fold. Savings evaporated. Millions who had lived their entire lives under a system of guaranteed employment and fixed prices woke up to a marketplace with nothing left to buy. In the West, analysts celebrated the victory of capitalism, but in truth, it was a triumph of credit. The same financial mechanisms that had propped up the Soviet Union for years, the loans, the bonds, the hidden dependency, became the tools of its liquidation. Bankers replaced generals as the architects of power. The Cold War had not ended in a battle of ideologies. It had ended in an audit. For the Russian elite that emerged from the ashes, debt was not a lesson. It was an opportunity. In the 1990s, the old state assets were privatized at impossible speed. Factories, oil fields, and mines were sold for a fraction of their value. The men who controlled those transactions, former bureaucrats, connected bankers, and regional bosses, became billionaires overnight. The Soviet debt had destroyed one empire, but created another, the oligarchy. These new magnates didn't build wealth. They captured it. They used the same foreign credit networks that had once financed the USSR to move their money abroad. To London, Cyprus, Switzerland. The same global financial architecture that had once trapped Moscow in debt now served as a hiding place for its stolen wealth. History had folded in on itself. By the late 1990s, Russia's foreign debt stood at nearly $150 billion. The ruble crisis of 1998 wiped out what little stability remained. The country defaulted, banks collapsed, and the illusion of recovery vanished. Once again, debt had undone an empire, but this time there would be no second union to replace the first. What few remember is that the Soviet Union's collapse was not inevitable. It was engineered by arithmetic, by the simple, brutal reality that no ideology can outspend its means. The same planners who dreamed of conquering the future were undone by interest rates and oil prices. In the end, the hammer and sickle fell not to freedom, but to finance. Even today, the legacy of that debt lingers. The system that replaced the Soviet Union, globalized, financialized, speculative, carries the same fragility. The empire of ideology became an empire of credit, and its heirs now live by the same rule that destroyed it. Money borrowed is power borrowed. The lesson of the Soviet debt is not just about the past. It's a mirror held up to every nation that believes its debts are eternal, its currency untouchable, its influence permanent, because the collapse didn't start with revolution or war. It started with a balance sheet too heavy to hold. Empires rarely fall in explosions. They sink, slowly, predictably, under the weight of numbers no one wants to read.